two of my favorite things growing up in the 90s. Video games and animated shows. Xmen the animated series was one of my favorite comic adaptation shows in that time period. Street Fighter 2 was one of my favorite video games to play during that era. Now what could be better than this? What creation could possibly happen that would make me an even bigger fan of both these franchises? Why, bringing them both together, of course. And via Capcom, that's exactly what happened. Two of my favorite franchises brought together in one epic ensemble in the form of
Xmen Vs Streetfighter!
The mere sight of Cyclops versus Ryu or Ken versus Gambit was mind-blowing to me. How was this going to be pulled off? I mean, it is the world of video games, so it's not a far-fetched thought in general, but the franchises, the characters and their rich histories is what made it such a fascinating prospect at first, and then would go on to become a legendary game, which would start off a whole series of versus games pitting Capcom's finest against Marvel's most popular characters. I had read articles and I'd seen images in various magazines, and I was immediately excited because up until that point there hadn't been quite the crossover of fighting games on this scale. Yes, you had the King of Fighters games already out on the market, but they were all SNK titles brought together as one. This was Street Fighter, the undisputed king of fighting games, teaming up with Marvel's supergroup, the X-Men, who already had their own introduction in the world of fighting games with X-Men Children of the Atom. A brilliant fighting game featuring the mutants and their villains, which introduced a new fighting style of super jumps and super combos, which would be incorporated into Xmen vs Street Fighter. The Street Fighter series was now in the alpha phase, so the character sprites were directly ported from that series and into this game. Now, just before I got to play Xmen vs Street Fighter, I had a small sample of what to expect. Akuma, who was a perennial secret character in Street Fighter games, makes a surprise appearance in the game X-Men Children of the Atom via a cheat code. Playing as a Street Fighter character in this game, it gave me that instant buzz, and immediately Capcom was onto a winner here. Fast forward to September of 1996 and the game made its first appearance in the arcades. The first thing noticed and was heavily promoted was the 2-on-2 combat system. Being able to select two characters and tag it out at will whilst performing tag combos, it was just so much fun to play. Given the looseness of the Marvel fighting game style, bringing the Street Fighters into this world made them more enhanced, which led to complete fun and chaos. The super combos seriously enhanced whilst performing the double team combos specifically with Ryu and Cyclops was very fun to pull off. Any combination of X-Men and Street Fighter characters provided you were good with these characters was just incredible. A new and exciting chapter had emerged for the Street Fighter series. Looking at the roster, it's an even split with 8 X-Men characters and 8 Street Fighter characters, totaling 16 characters to start off with. That actually becomes 17 with, as you guessed it, Akuma as a hidden character. On the X-Men side you had Cyclops, Wolverine and Storm returning after their debuts in X-Men Children of the Atom. You had the two bosses from that game, Juggernaut and Magneto, now as playable characters from the start, but seriously depowered as you would expect. Newcomers Rogue, Gambit and Sabretooth complete the Marvel side of the roster. On the Street Fighter side you had all 8 characters. They are taken straight from Street Fighter Alpha 2 with their super moves enhanced to fit in the Marvel style. My usual favourite combinations were Cyclops and Ryu, Ken and Gambit, Wolverine and Gambit. During this era of Street Fighter, Zangief was my least favourite character along with Dhalsim, so they were not used as much. I was always puzzled as to why they were chosen to be in this game when you had characters like Sagat or Fei Long or Guile, Adon and Guy. I feel those would have been better choices, but then again that's just my personal opinion. You had Cammy, Chun-Li and Charlie who were next in line. They were all fun to play as. Akuma of course was one of my favourites, and teaming him with Ken or Ryu or Cyclops or Wolverine was my go-tos as far as playing him was concerned. On the Marvel side, I was satisfied with the choices that they had put together, although I personally would have loved to have seen Psylocke or Iceman in this game. Spoiler, they do appear in a later version, Marvel vs. Capcom 2. But for the most part, I had fun interchanging with the X-Men characters, with Storm probably being my least favourite, not because she was bad, but just because I preferred the others. Gambit was a perennial favourite of mine, with his card attacks and his staff attack combos. On top of the fast and insane action, this game saw the introduction of Apocalypse, but not in the usual final boss manner you'd expect in fighting games. I mean, he grows and he covers a large chunk of the screen, and it's just down to getting as many hits on him as possible until he dies. If I'm being honest, his larger than life appearance doesn't match his difficulty at all. I found him fairly comfortable to beat, and to make matters worse, he's not even the final boss. It's your tag partner that has that honour, and I found that personally a bit of a disappointment. He should have been much harder to beat and be the absolute last person to beat. Now, he did appear to be the template for future bosses, with Onslaught from Marvel vs. Capcom and Galactus from Marvel vs. Capcom 3 being tough final bosses to beat, and what I feel should have been the case for Apocalypse. He does provide more of a challenge in the follow-up game Marvel Super Heroes vs. Street Fighter, but he's still not the final boss there. That's another story for another time. The Apocalypse issues aside, the overall impression of this game is that it is an absolute insane button bash combo filled game that still holds up to this very day. The game ruled in the arcades, but to home consoles, well, that was a much different story. The game was released on the Sega Saturn in Japan on November 27th, 1997, but it included a 4MB RAM cartridge which was needed to convert the game into an arcade perfect conversion. The RAM cartridge was a 100% necessity in order for the game to work, and internally the bosses at Sega had decided not to make the cartridge outside of Japan, meaning US and Europe customers were never going to get an official release. The only option would be to buy Japanese imports, as it was really the only real solution. So as a result, me and thousands of Sega Saturn owners never got to play the game outside of the arcade cabinets. Now, a port was eventually made for the PlayStation with a huge glaring omission: the omission of the tag mode. Now, it was a standard 2 vs 2 mode which severely hurt the game's real selling feature here, and to top it off, the lack of memory from the PlayStation saw the character sprites drastically reduced, so graphically it was inferior to the arcade port, and as a whole it was a poor conversion which reflected in some of the scores it received from various magazines. So for console owners from that generation, specifically in the US and in Europe, it was a huge miss not to have this on any of the consoles. It is absolutely insane to think that with the technologies of today, with the PS4, the PS5, Xbox One and the Xbox Series X, this game would have been an easy as pie conversion as opposed to what the Saturn and the PS1 had back in those days. And it really shows just how far gaming technology has come and will continue to evolve. Now, years later for me, I was able to finally get my hands on an emulator and play Xmen Vs Street Fighter, and it is every bit as enjoyable as to when I first played it in the arcades. Now, I have to confess, I own Marvel vs Capcom 2 New Age of Heroes, both on the PS2 and the PS3. And having played it to death, and it featuring pretty much every character from the Versus series up until this point, it wasn't as overwhelmingly fun playing Xmen vs Street Fighter at this point in time now. It was still a very enjoyable game, don't get me wrong, but the series had evolved at that point to a 3 vs 3 action, and going back to just 2 vs 2 felt a little bit like a step down, much like the dismal flop that was Marvel vs Capcom Infinite. Boy, did Capcom flop with this one. But another reason to enjoy Xmen vs Street Fighter is the awesome background music, which is miles superior to the oddly jazz-inspired background music you hear in Marvel vs Capcom 2. Xmen vs Street Fighter is still a very fun game to play, and if you can still get your hands on it, by all means go for it. Now sadly, this game has not yet been re-released on any modern day consoles, only via selected emulators which I was able to get a hold of, but I think it's about high time this got released to modern day consoles, if only for that nostalgic feel. Plus, with Capcom releasing Street Fighter 30th Anniversary and the upcoming Capcom Fighting Collection, surely we can get a Marvel vs. Series collection too. It was the start of the Versus series, which spun off into Marvel Superheroes vs. Street Fighter, and then Marvel vs. Capcom 1, 2, 3, and Infinite. So it started off this wonderful series, and it helped introduce a new style of fighting with the tag option, which is still used today in this genre and in other fighting game genres. So there's no doubt that this game has its legacy, and it's left its mark on the gaming industry, specifically the fighting games. Colourful characters, beautifully digitized sprites, over-the-top combo action, tag team insanity, ridiculous super moves. This game had the lot. So here's to the game that evolved the fighting game genre, made a popular group of comic book heroes even bigger, and added to a massive legacy in Street Fighter's long and storied history.
Xmen Vs Streetfighter!